You probably know Victoria Hennessey Cummins, but I'll tell you something about her anyway. She's the A.M. Pate Jr. Chair of History, Emerita, at Austin College in Sherman, Texas. She earned a Ph.D. in history from Tulane and is a Fulbright Scholar. Her current research deals with the role women have played in Texas regional art, a project that grew out of her long-standing interest in the Mexican muralist movement of the 1920s through 50s. Her published articles include Prejudice and Pride, Women Artists and the Public Works of the Art Project in East Texas, 1933-1934. She co-authored with her husband, Light Townsend Cummins, Frances Battelle Fisk, clubwoman and promoter of the visual arts in Texas Women, Their Histories and Their Lives. She's the co-editor and contributor to Cassetta's 2024 book that we're here celebrating today. So I present to you Vicki Cummins, who will use her teaching voice.
Yes. And be warned, you're going to get a blast of information about Kathleen Blackshear. Before I start, I just want to make a couple of notes. In the course of giving this paper, and I am doing this as a paper so that you actually get to lunch on time, you will hear the words colored and Negro. In every case, these are direct quotes, and I have left the words in because it gives you a time and place for what I'm talking about in the pre-World War II period. The second thing, we haven't seen this enough, right, is that the core of this presentation comes from the chapter I wrote on Blackshear for the book, as Light and I call it. It's the only book that's been in our lives for 5 years. I've been able to add some additional information because I was not limited by the page constraints that all of the authors had to live by. Otherwise, the book would be 1,000 pages long instead of 500. So, with all of that, let me begin my paper. Kathleen Blackshear was a native of East Texas who should be remembered as a pioneer of modern womanhood. This was not what one would expect from a white native East Texan of her time. One descended from two prominent families. Blackshear was raised to take her place in local society and live the life of a Southern lady. However, she chose not to do so, becoming instead a trailblazer who defied the conventions of her privileged upbringing in a number of ways. She developed her own ideas about her future and, despite societal pressure, had the agency to move beyond traditional gender roles. She was one of the few female faculty members at the Art Institute of Chicago prior to World War II, becoming an innovative teacher known for mentoring African American students. She made a name for herself as a professional artist at a time when the art world was marginalizing women in its professional ranks. She embraced modernism despite its being defined as an all-male movement. She befriended African Americans and portrayed them sympathetically in her art, and when this was not the norm for privileged white Southerners. She was a Texas maverick, unmarried, independent-minded, unconventional, self-supporting, and professional. And that's why I identify with her. And the more I learned about her, the better I like her. Anyway, Kathleen Blackshear was born in Navasota, Texas, Grimes County, June the 6th, 1897, to a prominent family. She grew up in an era of segregation and black oppression in the heart of the Old South part of Texas. Navasota was a large town, a trade center for cotton and flour, served by 3 railroads and a number of highways. It was then and is now the biggest town in Grimes County, although it's not the county seat. Anderson, little old Anderson, was then and is now. She was descended from slave owners. Her great-grandfather, General Thomas Edward Blackshear, who was one of the founders of Navasota, had moved to Texas from Georgia in 1858 with over 100 enslaved persons to start cotton planting. By the Civil War, he was one of the wealthiest residents of Grimes County, holding more than 150 enslaved persons. And he continued to prosper after the war by switching production to sharecropping. In her growing up years, the county was dominated by institutions of white supremacy, not special for this county, okay, very typical in East Texas. especially the White Man's Union, a whites-only organization of, quote, the best citizens of the county, formed in 1899 to reform politics, in their estimation, by ending what they called Negro rule, and that's a quote, that had dominated politics since Reconstruction. During Blackshear's youth, this group successfully suppressed the black vote by means of intimidation and violence. The WMU, as it was called, was so successful that it controlled Democratic Party nominations for local and county offices for decades. Not one of their candidates lost an election from 1900 to World War II. In this milieu, Blackshear attended whites-only schools, obviously, and would not have been encouraged to mix socially with the black community that comprised at least a third to a half of the county's population. Kathleen Blackshear's father, Edward Duncan Blackshear, chose not to farm, but rather to work in the town. He was a Baptist deacon, an officer in the local militia, and acted as the secretary for the town of Navasota. Her mother, born May Terrell, also came from a socially prominent family. She was also active in the Baptist Church and a number of women's clubs, including the Daughters of the American Revolution, the Daughters of the Republic of Texas, and the Pyrean Club. Today, there is a street in Navasota named for each of these families, and I might add that the penthouse suite at Navasota's P.A. Smith Hotel and Event Center is the Blackshear Suite. Kathleen Blackshear was brought up properly as a privileged young Southern white woman of her time. She began piano and art lessons at age 12 and violin lessons a couple of years later. She showed an interest in art early on, and at age 16, she traveled to Colorado Springs in California for a summer of art instruction. The society news sections of the Houston, Galveston, and Bryan, Texas newspapers regularly provided social reports of her youthful activities, including her participation in events of importance to the local gentry: bridge parties, 42 parties, club teas, and receptions, Sunday school picnics, music and art lessons, along with travel to Houston and around the state with family and friends. Readers learn that at 12, Kathleen played Rondo alla Turca by Friedrich Burgmüller at a piano recital. And at age 13, she and her cousin Mary Terrell served sherbet and cake to some 30 guests at an afternoon card party hosted by her mother. In her teens, Kathleen's name would be mentioned regularly in newspapers regarding events appropriate to a young lady of her class, attending card parties, hosting receptions for the engagement announcements of her friends, and traveling to and from Waco for college. Despite this conservative traditional upbringing, Blackshear was a maverick regarding the social conventions of her day and time. One reason is that while Blackshear's great-grandfather did not trust freedmen to work and actually recruited white sharecroppers from other parts of the South to work his land after the Civil War, his son, Kathleen Blackshear's grandfather, did not share his post-Civil War bitterness, despite having fought for the Confederacy. According to an interview she gave Chicago art critic C.J. Bulliett, it was he, the grandfather, quote, from whom she either inherited her own liberality and broadness of vision or had it grafted onto her as a small girl by his teaching and example. She spent her summers on the family's cotton lands, playing with the children of the sharecroppers who lived in their humble cabins. She got to know black people and came to appreciate their difficult way of life. Years later, she told Bulliett that they were, quote, the most beautiful people I know. She also flouted gender norms, being the first woman in her hometown to appear publicly wearing pants. At a time, oh, it's come up twice in one morning, right? And at the time she was doing it, it was scandalous behavior even for movie stars like Marlene Dietrich and Katharine Hepburn to be doing it in Hollywood. So imagine Navasota. Kathleen Blackshear was very well educated for any person in her time. At a time when less than 15% of teenagers were high school graduates and less than 5% of 23-year-olds, only a quarter of them women, earned bachelor's degrees, she had both. Later, she would be part of the 1% of the population who earned a master's degree prior to World War II. She was one of the 17 members of the Navasota High School graduating class of 1914, the first class to actually have a yearbook. She was named the art editor for the new yearbook, designed the cover, and provided illustrations. She was also multi-talented. She was also elected class poet, perhaps easier when there's only 17 of you. After high school, Blackshear enrolled at Baylor University. Notably, unlike half the female collegians of her time, she did not major in education. She continued her art and music lessons, graduating at age 20 in 1917 with an A.B. in modern languages, since there was no art major at Baylor or any other school in Texas during this period of time. Her thesis was titled Art Criticism in English Literature. At Baylor, she again illustrated the annual yearbook, as you can see on the right side of this slide. Over there, all the way in the right corner, you can see that little KB. That's how she signed everything at that time. At Baylor, she again illustrated the yearbook as well as designing the costumes for a play called Every Senior. I could tell you the plot, but no, seriously. Presented by the class of 1917. While at Baylor, she was greatly influenced by Dr. A.J. Armstrong, who was the chair of the English department and a scholar of Robert and Elizabeth Barrett Browning. As an undergraduate, Blackshear was the first to publicly urge the idea of a Browning shrine on the Baylor campus in an article she wrote for the student newspaper her senior year. This idea was eventually realized with the dedication of the Armstrong Browning Library in 1951 on the Baylor campus. Interestingly, Blackshear's photograph inscribed to Dr. Armstrong was placed in the library's cornerstone when it was dedicated. For 7 years after college graduation, Blackshear studied, worked, and traveled. In 1917-18, she attended the Art Students League in New York City, but she did not find the experience satisfying. She studied sculpture with Solon Borglum, portrait painting with Frank Vincent Dumont, and drawing with George Bridgman, but was dissatisfied with her instruction there. She was insulted to be told, probably by Dumont, the painting teacher, that she belonged to, quote, the donut school of painting. Observing that, she found the outer rim of the face more interesting than the features, which is a really odd statement if you know her work, especially the pre-1940 work. But okay, this is early. She left New York, and in the next years got a couple of college teaching jobs through Navasota connections. It turns out the president of both A&M and Tarleton State were former school superintendents from Navasota, and they knew the family, and that's how she got these jobs. In 1918, she taught French at the Agricultural and Mechanical College of Texas, Texas A&M, for 1 semester. Later, in the spring and summer of 1921, she was director of physical training for girls and taught mechanical drawing at John Tarleton Agricultural College, now Tarleton State University. Before you think how weird that is, she played volleyball in high school and basketball in college, even though she was a sub, not a starter. Okay. Between the teaching arrangements, and probably because she had earned some money and could do it, in 1920-21, she moved to Los Angeles and worked as a telephone operator and illustrator, and she toured Europe in the summer of 1920 with her former professor, Dr. Armstrong, and his wife. And this slide has 2 pictures from her sketchbook that she made during that summer. On the right are things from the National Archive and Museum in Barcelona, and on the left are from the British Museum, including in that upper right corner on the left, William, the famous blue hippopotamus from the British. Oh, he has a children's book written about him, all right? I bought it for my grandson. Okay, anyway, that's why I picked that particular page. At any rate, and the book is fascinating. It has notes about what she's seen and drawings about what she's seen, and you begin to see the influences early in her career. Between teaching assignments, in 1921, she moved back to Los Angeles, and then in 1924, toured Mexico. During this time, she did some writing, winning second prize for a poem, no, I have never seen it, called A Japanese Print, in a 1920 competition sponsored by the Houston Pen Women. Also, while she was at John Tarleton College, she worked with Margaret Birchwell to create the script for the first Mayfete that was ever done at John Tarleton College. So she's multi-talented. Unmarried and in her late 20s now, Blackshear enrolled at the School of the Arts Institute of Chicago in 1924. And that's probably about what it looked like on this postcard. It was a life-changing experience. There, she studied with John Warner Norton, Charles Fabens Kelly, William Owen, and most importantly, art historian Helen Gardner, who became her mentor and her friend. Gardner began teaching art history at the School of the Art Institute in 1920 and was the groundbreaking author of the best-selling volume Art Through the Ages, first edition 1926, 16th edition still in print. It's a little bit bigger than the first edition. Just saying, just saying. It was important as the first art history book to include pre-Western and non-Western art. And she worked as Gardner's assistant on the first edition as a student, and on the second and the third edition, she not only read and proofed the manuscripts, she also did analytical drawings for both of those editions, in the 1936 and the 1948 editions. While teaching, she continued to expand her education, taking courses in English at the University of Chicago and continuing to study at the Art Institute. She received her certificate in 1927 from the Art Institute's Department of Drawing, Painting, and Illustration, and immediately began graduate study. This is while she's on the faculty. She earned a Master of Fine Arts degree from the Art Institute while already teaching. Her thesis was named Studies of Negroes, 1924 to 1940. It was one of the first scholarly works to address artistic representations of Black persons. This is a self-portrait she did called Gallery Notes in 1926 when she was a student at the Art Institute. She's in the Art Institute collection, and not accidentally, given her interest in post-impressionism, behind her are a Gauguin over her left shoulder and a Van Gogh over her right shoulder. And I don't think that was just like, accidental. At any rate, from 1926 to her retirement in 1961, Blackshear was on the faculty of the School of the Art Institute. During her 35-year teaching career, she was one of the few female professors. Most of the female instructors taught decor, fashion, or art education. She didn't. In the 1960s, In the 1990s, some of the modern art professors at the Art Institute put on a retrospective show of her work, acknowledging her as a pioneer and role model for professional women as they struggled to balance home life and work life in the 1990s in an art world still dominated by men, as it was even more so when Blackshear was active. In addition to teaching art history, Blackshear offered regular courses in composition and others in things like design, silkscreen, and abstract art, which she was very interested in. Students found her unconventional. She did not fulfill their preconceived notions. She was a white Southerner, but she was empathetic, not condescending, to her African-American students. Students remembered her as a motherly woman, but she wore pants in public when ladies didn't, and had a short, boyish haircut, which you can see in this print. She was a soft-voiced, quiet lady who never lost her Southern accent. She was only 5'5" tall, but she could command a lecture hall. She was the professor, yet she ignored the expected distance between teacher and student in favor of collaborative work either in her studio or even in their homes. She was no academician. As one former student noted, her point of view was seldom completely orthodox. And here's a later yearbook picture. Blackshear students remembered her as an inspiring and visionary instructor who used her classes to introduce them to new ways of thinking about art. She stressed analyzing good art. It was not enough to just learn by copying it. One student remembered an assignment where each in the class had to choose an artist and execute a portrait of another classmate in that painter's style, and then write a paper explaining why they did it the way they did it. Like her mentor, Helen Gardner, Blackshear used her classes to move students' knowledge beyond the history of Western art. She introduced generations of Art Institute students to African, Asian, and Native American artworks, when for much of the period that she taught, These works were consigned to natural history museums and not considered fine art. She took her classes on trips to Chicago's Field Museum of Natural History and the Oriental Institute Museum at the University of Chicago to introduce them to this art. As a class exercise, she had them draw the art objects until they could master the aesthetics. It was for most of them their first experience in the appreciation of non-Western art, and it was exhilarating, especially to her African American students, to hear her refer to it as great art. Painter William Carter recalled of her, quote, "She was from Dixie, but she liked colored people. She taught us about African art. We never had any reference to African art in my art history classes when I was in high school." Blackshear's sympathy with African Americans was reflected in her relationship with her black students. The Art Institute of Chicago was one of the first institutions to admit African American students, among them Archibald J. Motley Jr., who graduated in 1918, and Blackshear was a student at the same time as sculptor Richmond Barthé. As a teacher, she influenced the development of artists Charles White, William Carter, shown here, Margaret Burroughs, and Eldezer Corder, among others. They praised her for her commitment to introducing them to non-Western, especially African art, in her classes. Her respect for the aesthetics and emotional power of African art inspired many of her students, both black and white, to embrace it as an influence in their own work. Blackshear encouraged her African American students when society at large still devalued their aspirations to be professional artists. Eldezer Corder later remembered being infused with inspiration by her art history classes. All of a sudden I could see, and I became very excited, and I wanted to participate in this in some kind of way. It was her enthusiasm for African art that really got to me. That was the most important influence of all of my work. It was through contact with her that I came to appreciate the true meaning of art history, of composition, and of life drawing. Blackshear not only mentored her black students academically, she was also known to give them material support. Corder remembered that she, quote, consistently encouraged me, even to the point of buying a few of my things. Blackshear also helped him get a scholarship to switch from the part-time night school to the full-time day school. And when he graduated, she helped him get employment with the WPA Arts Project. In 1940, he and fellow Art Institute graduates Archibald J. Motley Jr., Charles White, William Carter, and Margaret Burroughs became founding members of Chicago's South Side Community Arts Center, a WPA Federal Art Project foundation whose mission was to help local black artists. And by the way, it's one of only two in the country still operating in its original building with its same original mission. Margaret T. Burroughs, who earned a doctorate and became an art educator and influential cultural leader in Chicago, was also supported financially as a student at the Art Institute. At one point, as an undergraduate in the teacher education program, Burroughs basically ran out of money. She owed tuition, she didn't have any money to buy materials, and she couldn't get her class work done. She went to see her advisor, who told her she should drop out and get a job and try to earn enough money to come back the next semester. And she was distraught. She ran into Blackshear, who asked her what was the problem. And when she told her, Blackshear said, "Don't drop out. Just hang in there. You're a good student, and maybe something good will happen." Within a couple of weeks, Burroughs found out that an anonymous donor had paid her tuition and set up an account for her to draw on to get the art materials she needed to do her work and finish the semester. No one at the bursar's office would tell her who did it, ever, but she was always convinced it was Blackshear who had come up with the money. While on the faculty of the Art Institute, Blackshear did other freelance work. In 1932-33, she was awarded 2 commissions to create cycloramas for Chicago's Century of Progress exhibition. And in addition to her work on the first 3 editions of Gardner's Art Through the Ages, she provided analytical drawings like these for other art books. Helen Gardner's Understanding the Arts, published in 1932, Helen Mackenzie's Understanding Picasso, A Study of His Style and Development, 1940, and Catherine Kuh's Art Has Many Faces, which this is from, The Nature of Art Presented Visually. In her introduction to Art Has Many Faces, Kuh praised Blackshear, whose work, quote, provided a series of drawings analyzing the form of a guitar which clarified the meaning of cubism. So the big the big image on the right is Picasso. The other 5 are Blackshear deconstructing a guitar from various points of view to give the reader an idea of how Picasso might have conceptualized the final print. Okay. Despite living and working in Chicago, Blackshear never lost touch with her Texas roots. She returned home to Navasota for the winter holidays always, and most summers during her nearly 4 decades at the Art Institute. Also, in the year after her father died in 1929, she took a leave of absence from the Art Institute, and during that time, she taught a course at the Museum of Fine Arts Houston School. She also maintained a studio in Houston and participated in Houston exhibitions during that year. And of course, in Texas, she continued to make her art. Her nephew, Billy Joe Terrell, remembered her going downtown in Navasota on Saturdays. You're going to see 3 different things called Saturdays, so you can see she really did spend a lot of Saturdays downtown. She used to go downtown to sketch the activities of country people coming in to do their weekly shopping. Some of these sketches would later become prints and paintings that are featured in her MFA thesis. Blackshear exhibited her work not only in the Midwest, but also in numerous Texas venues. She was an active exhibitor from the mid-1920s to the late 1960s, participating in dozens of juried art shows. Her work received recognition in a number of these exhibitions. As both an alumna and a faculty member at the School of the Art Institute, she participated in many of their shows. She won an honorable mention in her first exhibition, and in 1927, her portrait Emma won the Art Institute's Alumni Portrait Prize. Her work was also a part of numerous exhibitions by the Artists of Chicago and vicinity and the Art Institute's special exhibitions. She was very partial to block prints, and I am very partial to her block prints, so you're going to see a lot of them before I'm finished. Blackshear joined the Chicago Society of Artists, a self-defined avant-garde group in the 1920s. Eventually, she became their secretary and then their president. She participated in their annual autumn exhibitions many times. In 1934, her picture, Dance at the Michigan Avenue Bridge, won a bronze medal, and she won another bronze medal in 1937. She also contributed linoleum prints like this one to the Society's annual calendars from the late 1930s to the mid-1960s. Between 1930 and 1957, she participated in more than a dozen shows in Chicago and Evanston, Illinois. Because of her deep identification with the Lone Star State, Blackshear also exhibited widely in Texas during her career. Her work was accepted for the 6th and 10th annual exhibitions of work by Houston artists in 1930 and 34 at the Museum of Fine Arts, Houston. In 1930, her painting, The Strummer, which is almost certainly, you can see from this picture, a portrait of Mance Linscomb, who was a songster and blues artist from Navasota. He's also a native. He was born in 1899, so he's really approximately a peer. This won the lucrative $250 purchase prize in 1930. I actually looked it up. That's about $4,000 today. So that'd buy a lot of art supplies. She exhibited at the 25th annual exhibition by Texas artists in Fort Worth at the Carnegie Library in 1935, the 1936 exhibition at the Central Centennial Exhibition in Dallas, Ruby Lee and Lula Mae Washington, which you'll see in a minute, and the 1939 State Fair exhibition, Texas Synthesis, which you'll also see, at the DMA. Actually, it was the DMFA back then. She participated in several of the annual Texas exhibitions of painting and sculpture, circuit shows that traveled around between the Dallas Museum of Art, the Houston Museum of Fine Arts, and the Whitty in San Antonio. At the 11th, in 1949-50, the judges unanimously but mistakenly chose her crayon and ink drawing, Armadillo, for the Fort Worth Art Association's 100 Purchase Prize for Best Watercolor. When the judges figured out their mistake, they went to the Fort Worth Art Association and they said, okay, here's the deal. Why don't we pick the second best watercolor, which was by Cecil Casbier, and we'll give that the $100, and we'll just give $50 to this. And the Fort Worth Art Association came back and said, no, we're going to buy this one and give the $50 to Cecil Casbier. And that is apparently what happened. Unfortunately, this is known for its colorfulness. What I have is a black and white from Art Digest. But you can see that her style will be changing from some of her early work. She also won awards. She also won prizes at the 5th Texas Crafts Exhibition for jewelry enameling. She won an award for the San Antonio Art League's first Texas watercolor exhibition in 1950. And in 1956, the San Antonio Craft Guild awarded 2 prizes for 2 of her enamel pins, none of which I have a picture of, I'm sorry to say. Although in her faculty picture she's wearing one, what I don't know is whether that's hers or somebody else did it for her. She had 2 one-man shows, and yes, that's how they called them. Think of it as woman as actor, okay? I mean, before we get all feminist here, okay. She had 2 one-man shows in her lifetime, one at the Whitty Museum in 1941 and another at Chicago's 750 studio in 1950. As an artist, Blackshear's output falls into 2 periods with distinct differences in subject matter, style, and approach. Prior to 1940, she focused on African Americans and their lives as her main subject matter, and her works were largely representational with modernist influences. After 1940, the majority of her works depicted animals and inanimate objects in an increasingly non-representational and abstract manner. Prior to 1940, defying stereotypical expectations of her as a white Southerner, in the 1920s and 30s, she sympathetically presented the everyday lives of rural and urban African Americans in representational works influenced by modernist movements such as post-impressionism and Cubism. In her introductory comments, this is what she showed in the Central Centennial Exhibition show of the best of Texas art in 1936. In her introductory comments to her 1940 Master of Fine Arts thesis, Blackshear tried to explain her long-held interest in depicting African Americans and their lives, and I quote, "The Negro chose himself as a subject. It may have been the early Texas environment, or it may be that the Negro embodies an idea of beauty. Perhaps the rhythm of his movements and the grace of his living are tied closely with his color and outward form. Whatever the reason may be, or whether there is a reason, here are the studies, and they cover 16 years. These experimental studies have really just begun." Ruby Lee and Lula May is included in her thesis. So are these 2, which are probably the 2 most famous of her works, A Boy Named Alligator on the left, and the portrait of Robert Gould on the right. The scenes she chose to create, like the Strummer, which you've seen, A Boy Named Alligator and a portrait of Robert Gould right here, reflected the social realism movement influencing American regional artists, showing people at work, shopping, relaxing, or just visiting, although she herself claimed no social significance or adherence to regionalism or the American scene in her approach. She didn't like to be pigeonholed. The art critic and friend of hers, C.J. Bulliett, pointed out that while her sketchbooks contained realistic drawings of people that she had known and observed in her paintings and prints were less natural and realistic. Her depictions of African Americans in the 20s and 30s often used what he referred to as the simplified forms, radical foreshortenings, and strong geometric shapes of modernism. She did exaggerate facial features in works like Portrait of Helen, or Going Back, A Boy Named Alligator, somewhat less so in Robert Gould, and also in lino cuts like these, Ruby Lee on the left and Baptism on the right. But while these depictions may seem to us in the 21st century to be politically incorrect, you could see that you could understand them as caricatures if you didn't know the context. The context is really important. You have to know the sources that influence these representations and to understand them in the context of modernism. These exaggerated features were reminiscent of the representations in powerful African sculptures, as pictured on the right in her lithograph masks, and on the left we have some of the masks that were the influence. And it's clear that she, like Picasso and a lot of the modernists, had studied African art, which I've already told you, and that it had influenced her depictions. And she's trying to get the power of the African art. And here is one more portrait. This one is not really exaggerated, but I wanted to put it in because you see the darkness, and everybody assumes that the post-impressionists and the cubists are her major influences, but I see a lot of Diego Rivera. Not his murals, I see his easel paintings. And his desire to present the peasantry in its dignity and its glory. And I think that she had been to Mexico in 1924. She went to Detroit to look at the big murals in Detroit. And I think she was a woman of many influences. And I think that Diego Rivera is one that should be included as much as anything else. In 1939, C.J. Bulliett, who I talk about a lot, acknowledged her as Chicago's most sympathetic, most understanding painter of the American Negro. Much later, another art critic of Chicago, Alan Artner, this is in the 90s, commented that Blackshear's early work indicates she was a modernist, although one with a humanistic bias. Her enduring subject was the life of African Americans, which she approached with a high degree of realism, despite a vocabulary indebted to European abstraction. Although generally well received, Blackshear's portraits of African Americans were not immune to negative criticism. In reviewing the 1929 autumn show of the Chicago Society of Artists, Chicago critic Eleanor Jewett, who was known for her dislike of modernism, dismissed it as, quote, depressing, painful, and dull as ditch water, being the work of a little band of earnest workers in the bazaar, each clutching vehemently at the skirts of modernism and self-expression. She singled out Blackshear's work in the show for specific criticism, but I will say, in her defense, both of their defense, Jewett would later come around and actually come to like Blackshear's work. By the late 1930s, Blackshear's work was showing an increased movement away from representational art. Remember that abstract art can be representational or non-representational, okay? She's moving away from representational art. The drift had been there for a long time, actually. Her 1929 painting, Zinnias, is a still life reminiscent of some of the things that Vincent van Gogh was doing in his flower paintings, like roses and anemones done in 1890. And her jugs and gourds looks like it was influenced by Cézanne's still lifes, okay? She exhibited her fanciful and vaguely surrealist, I don't know about blue cactus with, spines that look like that. She exhibited her fanciful and vaguely surrealist modernist 1938 still life Texas synthesis in a juried show at the 1939 State Fair of Texas, as well as an invitational show, which Ward Lockwood called representative of the finest in Texas, that was put together for the inauguration of Homer Price Rainey that same year. It may have been influenced by George O'Keeffe's Cattle Heads, which she did in the 1920s. Certainly Richard Foster Howard thought that in his review. But nothing that George O'Keeffe ever did looked like this. They were much simpler and much starker. But it does seem to have had influences on two subsequent paintings by Texas artists. That's Jerry Bywater's Much Better Known on the Ranch, which was done in 1941, and the incredibly surrealist Mildred Norris Compton's West of Town that was done in 1940. Some of her works had manifested Cubist influences. For example, Woman in Barbed Wire, which is it's the middle one, okay? Women in Barbed Wire and Girl's Head, which is the one on the left, clearly show some influence of early Picasso works. She may have been like Emma Richardson Cherry, which Randy Tibbetts always says, she wanted to be a Cubist, but it didn't sell, so she kind of worked it in the vases and the flowers. Well, I think we may have that going on here too. Like I said, many, many different influences. What's interesting is at the same time she's doing this kind of stuff, she can also do realist paintings. This is a portrait of Florence Arquin, who is a painter, a gallery owner, an art critic, in Chicago, done in 1932. In 1930, she did a portrait of the dean of the college at Southwestern University in Georgetown. Equally realistic. Why would she do that? The word commission comes to mind. You may not know this, but Diego Rivera spent the 19 teens while the Mexican Revolution was going on. He was in Paris. And when he was in Paris, he was painting Cubist things. And somebody asked him later, why are you doing that? You don't believe in it. And he said, that's what people wanted. I had to eat. So artists take commissions. I mean, it does show that Blackshear chose what she painted because she could have done other things. She completed her MFA thesis, Studies of Negroes from 1924 to 1940, at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago in 1940. By the way, once she graduated, they gave her tenure. Remember, most artists did not have university educations. So someone with an MFA, plus all of her art training, would have been someone you would want on your art faculty. The thesis consisted of 30 documentary photographs, mostly of black persons from Navasota, and over 100 images of Blackshear's graphics, paintings, and small sculptures, quote, that present the Negro as seen through one person's interests, shown by means of value, texture, and color. And here are two more of her block prints from her master's thesis. In the introductory comments to her thesis, she stated that, quote, the Negro is a superb subject, and perhaps there will be 16 years more of this particular series of studies. Yet, after 1940, she moved increasingly towards non-representational abstract works on paper. She redirected her subject focus from African Americans to nature and inanimate objects, while shifting towards increasing abstraction in paintings, prints, and textiles. These later works strongly reflected her interest in African American sculpture and textiles, producing prize-winning works like Armadillo and Giraffe. You can see from this mixed media giraffe and the lithograph on the right called Head, which, by the way, when my husband first saw it, he thought it was a vase because he had it upside down. I pointed out to him that usually artists sign the bottom of the print and not upside down on the top. Anyway, you begin to see that here, these are both from the mid-40s. She's clearly moving away towards abstraction. She's reduced that giraffe to some basic forms, right? And actually, I can see why if you turn Head upside down, you would think it was a vase. But when it's right side up, you can see what it is. Her friend, the Chicago art critic, C.J. Bulliett, explained her new direction this way. Miss Blackshear is fascinated by the abstract and believes she can interpret best that way. She reduces a drawing of a rhinoceros or a gorilla to the lowest terms of simplification, to lines and volumes, to non-objective forms that make sense to her. And I think you can really see this in that giraffe. Even more so in these prints. Referring to her post-1940 period, contemporary East Texas artist Russell Cushman has commented, during this time, she found inspiration in abstract compositions, fashioning flamboyant geometric rearrangements of animals. Right? That's, by the way, if you can't tell, that's a crab in the middle of the one on the left, African masks, and still lives. She also experimented with ceramics and grew to love batiks, a complex treatment of fabric with dyes and wax. And if you look at batiks, these are a couple of just basic traditional African batiks, and you look back at this, you begin to see the visual referencing. And everybody says that. Everybody who writes about her later work says that. I see another influence. These are molas by the Kuna people of San Blas Island. Remember, she studied Native American art. And why I agree that the batiks are clearly an influence, I think when I look at something like the crab, and even the giraffe, and some of her works even more so, I see both this influence and possibly this influence as well. During this period of her career, she received more critical praise for her textiles, her prints, and her gouaches than her modernist oils. In 1941, Eleanor Onderdonk at the Whitty hastily mounted a one-man show of 50 of Blackshear's work, as a replacement for a Southern State Arts League circuit show that did not arrive on time in the chaos after Pearl Harbor, which completely messed up the transportation system. And Blackshear agreed to do this. Local art writer, this is San Antonio art writer, Sigmund Byrd, liked many of her prints, but was generally dismissive of Blackshear's geometric doodling, which she calls rhino heads, that was a painting, and her portraits of African Americans, which he said were done in drab, negroid tone that is both dingy and colorful. Okay, you know, that was a quote. I don't agree, but you know, it's like, you could be one of those, right? But I don't think you could be both. However, having said that, he did find some pieces pleasing. He particularly liked, quote, a wash painting called Baptism that has dignity and primitive purity, like an African carving. And there are giraffes, more rhinoceri, perhaps like this one. This is actually a Christmas card from later on, and some authentic Texana among the prints that is truly distinguished. He especially liked her linoleum prints. Yes, I like them too. Okay. Remember him? Okay. Here, back again in the presentation for a second time, is our armadillo. While not overly impressed by the 11th Texas exhibition in 1949, Art Digest writer Alonso Lansford praised Blackshear's prize-winning armadillo as, quote, a handsome, witty, conventionalized suggestion of Navajo weaving. Recognizing it as only one of a few exceptionally fine things, this is a quote, exceptionally fine things of the highest professional standards, in a show that he generally reviewed as ho-hum. Okay, so she got singled out. Writing for Art News in 1950, Marilyn Robb praised Blackshear's batiks. Puckerstruck is the word. I never heard this word before. Puckerstruck is the word for Kathleen Blackshear's color batiks at the Evanston Arts Center and in her one-man show at the 750 studio. An old Cape Cod term meaning an element of mischief distributed by Puck, Puckerstruck applies to Blackshear's brand of well-designed fantasy. Scraped and scratched and worked over by the hour, her batiks have a rich texture plus color as hot as chili con carne, which I am sorry to say you can't see in this particular armadillo. You can see the batik influence again. This is one of her Christmas cards that she sent out to her friends. I think this one is from the 1950s. In 1951, the Chicago Tribune art critic Eleanor Jewett, remember her, right, an earlier detractor, praised Blackshear, writing, Kathleen Blackshear has an intriguing design beautifully handled in crayon and gouache on bark cloth. However, writing in the 1990s, Alan Artner, who I've talked about before, was more ambivalent. Blackshear's later work became indirect and abstract, showing the inspiration of African textiles rather than incidents of daily life. This gives a decorativeness always pleasing, but a little too ready to charm. I don't agree, okay? But I felt like I had to put him in there since he's the art critic. At any rate, Blackshear left the Art Institute in 1961 at the age of 64 and retired to her hometown of Navasota, Texas. A series of events resulted in her decision to retire. First, her mother had died in February of 1961 at age 86. Since her father had died in 1929 as an only child, Blackshear took over the family home. Secondly, her mother's death relieved Blackshear of financial concerns she had had over having to support her mother as her mother aged. And she could now afford to retire on Social Security plus her pension for having taught 35 years at the Art Institute. Thirdly, and importantly, although she was 5 years younger than Blackshear, her faculty colleague and longtime companion, Ethel Spears, was forced to retire the same year due to declining health. Spears had established the enameling department at the Art Institute in the 1950s and had experienced growing health problems in the previous decade. In 1955, she had been officially diagnosed with lead poisoning, which both she and her doctors believed was related to her work with enameling in poorly ventilated classrooms. For a number of years, the Art Institute paid Ethel Spears' medical bills, but in 1961, their insurance company declined further coverage for her, and Spears had to retire on Social Security with an income of less than $100 a month. Yeah, I did it. Not enough in 1961 even, okay? She was denied her pension because she was 3 years short of the 20-year minimum, even though she got sick because she was teaching at the Art Institute in unventilated classrooms. So she got treated badly, and Kathleen Blackshear knew this. Finally, by 1961, Blackshear was very unhappy with the changes that had been made to the art history courses at the School of the Art Institute by administrators. In a terse letter to Alan McNabb, the director of administration for the Art Institute, she wrote, quote, "I cannot go on in this department in a shattered form. I would probably be retired in another year. It seems best to retire now." She was not to be mollified by McNabb's protestations of regret for her pending departure, or his attempts to assuage her bitterness by celebrating her service to the school, testily refusing his offer to hold a luncheon in her honor, writing that since everyone attending would know the true circumstances of her leaving, quote, "I am afraid the occasion would be very uncomfortable." I've been a faculty member, I can relate to that. Okay. The wording, not the circumstance. Okay. Despite retiring as a full professor and having served the school for 35 years as a full-time teacher, Blackshear would wait nearly 7 years for the School of the Art Institute of Chicago to recognize her service by conferring the title of Professor Emeritus in 1968. I was made a Professor Emeritus 3 months before I retired, which is pretty much how it's done today. Okay, so it's an insult. Okay. Kathleen Blackshear and Ethel Spears went to live in the Blackshear family home in Navasota, and here it is today. In their first years there, they both remained active in the art world. They shared an art studio at the Felder Street residential property. They both continued to show their work and contributed prints to the Chicago Society of Artists annual calendars. Both gave slide lectures at museums and to civic groups, each supporting the others by running the accompanying slides. Light and I have done that more times than I could tell you. Blackshear, oh, here they are, at an art exhibit in Dallas. Blackshear delivered lectures on diverse topics such as Indians of the Southwest, Vincent van Gogh, surrealism, modern art in America, and contemporary art and artists of the world. And those are just like 5 I picked from the list. She also occasionally served as a juror for competitive exhibitions. The last exhibition of her work was at Hemisphere in San Antonio in 1968, where Blackshear exhibited a large armadillo. I don't think it's that one, I think it's another one. As Spears' influence progressed, her memory failed. Eventually, she needed nursing care. She died at age 71 in 1974. Blackshear continued to live in Navasota until her death at age 91 in 1988, having been moved to skilled nursing care in the 1970s because of dementia. They are buried next to each other at the Oakland Cemetery in Navasota. In summary, Kathleen Blackshear was a maverick all her life. She was raised in racist Jim Crow, East Texas, to be a lady in white-dominated Southern society. Her prescribed life should have seen her take her place in local society as a wife and mother and continue the family line. Yet, unlike most young women of her generation, she did not marry and instead pursued an independent career as an artist and teacher. She grew up white and privileged during the era of segregation, yet she chose to express her appreciation for African Americans in her art and teaching, and she chose to support the aspirations of Black artists throughout her teaching career. She influenced generations of art history students at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago to appreciate non-Western art. At a time when modern art was not associated with women artists and not wildly appreciated in the US, she embraced modernism over academicism. Yeah, I have it written out. It's good she wasn't an academic. And she instilled those values in her students. And let me say that when I agreed to give this talk, I had no idea when it would be. But the fact that we're a couple of days past Juneteenth and that this is the middle of Pride Month, I think makes it especially appropriate to give it. Thank you.
We have just a few minutes, Professor.
That's fine.
I think we have just a few
See, I've stunned them. No, Jack, yeah.
Do you know if she ever had any relationship with John Biggers in terms of professional?
No, I don't know of any. I don't know of any. She did remain active in Houston, but I've never seen that connected. Even though Biggers was active, by the time she retired. Yeah.
Do you think her position as having grown up in the South, in the presumably bigoted culture of...
Not presumably. Okay. Historians agree on this.
Her family culture, immediate family culture, was much more open than the larger culture in which they were ensconced. Do you think that gave her a special moral authority as an instructor and professor in Chicago?
I probably don't think so. I think it was her personality. The more I learn about her, the more that I realize that she understood what everybody wanted for her. And she understood that wasn't going to happen, that was not her. And she simply did it. And I love that fact about her. Whatever pressures were on somebody like me, who are so much younger than she is, 10 times, right? Everything about her growing up, she should have been a bigot. But she never was. Why was she so sympathetic? Well, I think her explanation is the one I gave you. That's the one she gave in an interview to the art critics. But I think she probably had a sympathy for other marginalized peoples because she was marginalized herself as a gay person. But I don't have a smoking gun there. But I have a very strong feeling from reading about her that it's more than one thing. She's a very complex person and a very accomplished person. She is as important as a teacher, maybe more important than she is an artist.
It's fascinating to me that I've done photography on her works in her home and stuff like that. It's fascinating to me that there's no hint of her ever playing a victim.
No, she doesn't. She is agency. She is proactive. And so to me, that is one you can be tough-minded and be civil and polite and nice and cultured, but she had to be one tough-minded individual. And I just tremendously admire her. And like I said, the more I learn, the more I admire. I really... Those faculty members in the 90s who put on the retrospective were right. She's a real role model. And she was doing it in the 20s and 30s. And it was still hard in the 70s and 80s. I guess as a faculty member, I do identify with her. Ken?
Thinking back to her formative period at a certain university in Waco, the relationship with Professor Armstrong, who's someone who's associated with the Brownings and with taking lots of donor groups to Europe, and the whole library is bringing European culture to America, and so it seems like it's a setup for traditional European elitism, and yet at the same time in the 30s, Professor Armstrong brings Marian Anderson to Waco, and she performs at Waco Hall.
Yes, of all places, yeah.
In a city where there wasn't a hotel that took black people.
Yes.
So in your study of that period, was there any sort of takeaway that she got in terms of a broader view of culture that wasn't just exclusively European, but could be open?
You mean prior to going to the Art Institute?
Right, yeah.
Well, I mean, in Europe, they went Italy, Spain, France, England, and those are the ones I remember off the top of my head. And if you read the whole journal and look at all the pictures, they were going to ruins because she was always very interested, as was Helen Garner, in architecture as art, right? And so she had done a lot of the ancient and the pre-modern. As I guess you might say an art tourist, right, on this trip that she took with the Armstrongs. But in terms of African and Native American and Asian art, I think that really is when she gets to Chicago. And partly because, you know, you have the Field Museum and you have the Oriental Institute. So not only do you have Helen Gardner encouraging it, but you also have access to it. And I'm not saying it's not there, I'm saying I haven't seen it. Yeah.
Yes. In your study, did you find any way that she experienced prejudice because of how she was at that time? I mean, anything that she personally wrote about?
No. Her papers in the Archives of American Art are pretty sparse. I mean, they're so sparse they put hers and they are the Blackshear and Spears papers. And I don't think it's just because they ended up living in Navasota together. I think it's because there's just not that much. I mean, I think it's 5 boxes, which is not much for personal papers. And so there isn't a lot to indicate that. It may be that in Chicago, which was, you know, she's at an art school that accepts black people in the pre-World War I period. So that's just pretty liberal. And in the art world, I think you would be less likely to hit that prejudice, and it's pretty clear she was closeted. You know, there's nothing in there that indicates that relationship except the retirement, because Spears was from Chicago and had family in Chicago, but she ends up in Navasota, and they die 15 years apart, but their plots are, you saw the picture, the plots are next to each other, even though there are family plots on her side of the family in that. So, I mean, I think there's a certain decision-making there. And you know, the Archives of American Art, the Illinois Art Project, Becky Duval Reese's book, I mean, they all identify this, but I think in her lifetime it was very low-key. But again, I may read something in 2 weeks that tells me something. Well, that's the great thing about it. You can always revise when you get more information. We got time for Jack?
He had to be one of the first individuals in this country to receive an MFA degree. And interestingly, Corrine Spellman received one in 1942 because the MFA was only offered for the first time in that.
Exactly. And I researched this. 1%, men and women together, 1% of Americans had of any kind, master's degree prior to World War II. And so she was highly educated. And that's why they were so glad. I mean, many art faculties, the art was being taught by people who didn't have college degrees. I've researched Don Brown. At Centenary, he had to get a bachelor's degree in English so they could give him tenure. Because you didn't go to college to study art, because it wasn't there to study. So, you know, they looked at her and like, oh my heavens, you already have a bachelor's degree, you know. And then you got a certificate. You didn't get an undergraduate degree then. You got a certificate, but you could then do graduate study.
All right. Thank you, Vicki. That was spectacular.
Oh, why am I clapping?